We're sort of getting to the end of psychoactive plants, some of which are used recreationally, but almost all of the indigenous contexts in which we study these psychoactive plants are in the context of healing. So they're either taken to heal patients or healing practitioners take them for guidance on how to heal patients or to go set some sort of cosmic dysfunction or imbalance, right? So today we're not going to talk really at all about herbal remedies. We're going to save that for the next class. But what I want to talk about is the context in which herbal remedies are used. So it's important to understand the cultural concepts of disease and illness and health, because these aren't things that are universal. Every culture has its own definition of health and disease, and understanding the parameters of this normalcy and actual cultural cosmology can have a lot of insight into why people use plants in certain places, why those plants are effective for healing in certain places, but might be ineffective elsewhere. So I think that without understanding a culture and its formulation of these concepts of health and disease, you can't really understand medicinal plants. Will be my thesis here. I'll say if you're interested in medical ethnobotany or these types of ideas, there's a lot of courses here at UH to study this. So in the botany department, there's Botany 442, which is medical ethnobotany. This is a really fun class, and it's all project-based. So students work in groups, come up with some sort of issue or problem, and then do research and work together to learn. So it's sort of a unique structure to that class, and I highly recommend that. There's a lot of Hawaiian studies classes. So there's a whole series on La'au Lapa'au, which is the herbal component of Hawaiian healing. Like I said, in Hawaiian systems also there's a number of components to healing that don't necessarily involve plants, but there's at least 3 classes that involve processing and understanding and diagnosing and treating people with plants. Keoki Baklean used to come give a guest lecture in this class, but now he's really busy teaching, so he has a conflict at the same time. Yeah? Okay.
Why don't doctors, like now, traditionally, when you go to the doctor, they don't try to treat you with plants? Like instead, they use like, pills, which, are derived from plants, but why don't they give you remedies?
Well, I think there are a couple of answers to that question. So one is that there's a lot of different types of doctors, right? So if you went to an herbalist, say a Chinese herbalist in Chinatown, or you went to a naturopath, or you went to a practitioner of La'au Lapa'au, then their remedies would probably involve a fair number of plants, among other treatments as well. It could be massage, or it could be chanting, or it could be steam baths, but it might involve plants. But this other component of medicine, like your typical doctor at Straub or Queens, don't prescribe plants because they're sort of parameterized in what they can prescribe based on their training and what the Food and Drug Administration allows. There's a lot of quality control issues that go with prescribing plants. It's hard to control dosage of active compounds. We're seeing this now with the cannabis treatment centers, right, where all of their plants have to go through the screening process, so you know exactly how much THC or cannabinoids, whatever compound that you're prescribing is contained within those plants. It's expensive, it's difficult to control, and often all of the other stuff that comes in plants can have side effects too, right? So it may be easier just to prescribe a single isolated alkaloid from a plant rather than a plant that contains a myriad of these types of chemicals. But as we're going to see today, a lot of it is also cultural. So a lot of it is what patients believe will actually work for them and what the doctor believes will work for them. And it's this idea of trust that is actually an important part of the healing system in our culture. And so that's one of the main reasons, I think, why we don't treat ourselves with plants. But we do treat ourselves with plants quite a bit also. I think if you're sick, you probably drink herbal teas to make your throat feel better. Maybe your mom used to give you chicken soup, which is a healing type of food, right? So there's a lot of plants that we supplement our diet with to make ourselves feel better that we don't even really consider. It's almost subconscious or second nature. More on that in a second. As I mentioned before, these definitions aren't consistent across cultures, and it's important to understand these in order to understand why certain plants are or are not used. And the reason that I put up this, does anybody know what this is a picture of? Say it again? A mahjong table or template. It's from that culture, yeah. So this is a mandala. This is in Tibetan Buddhist tradition. And this specifically is the Kala Chakra mandala. And it's very beautiful. This is the one that monks will create out of sand. It'll take months to create this mandala out of sand, and then it'll all blow away. And it symbolizes the ephemeral nature of being. What it symbolizes, you see there's all of these concentric rings, and this is a two-dimensional depiction of this multi-dimensional universe in which Tibetans inhabit. Right? So they believe that their world is imbued with spirits, with people in the present, in future lives, in past lives, so it's very multi-dimensional. And all of these are nested within each other and pertain to the life and the experience that we're experiencing today. Right? So in their whole understanding of disease, it's hard to place necessarily a proximal cause of a disease. So we say you have a sore throat because you have a bacterium in your throat, but in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, it might be, your disease might be caused by some karma that you accrued in a past life. Right? So it doesn't necessarily translate to our idea of temporality or treatment. And so understanding this concept of karmic, accruing karma and getting rid of that karma in order to heal yourself is something that's sort of foreign to us, right? And so if I went to Tibet and tried to study medicinal plants, I'd have to first understand this whole concept of existence. So there are many medical traditions, right? And I'm going to call, instead of using this term Western medicine, I'm going to call it globalized medicine, because Western sort of suggests that this predominant medical tradition where we go and see the doctor in the white lab coat and they prescribe pills is something that only occurs in the West, when actually it's globalized. It's all over the world. So even in places like China or Tibet, they have these types of medical clinics, especially in big cities. Right? So it's globalized at this point. It's not just Western. So we find that all over the world. And Western, we use that specifically because the origins of this medical tradition are Greek. So our medical tradition dates back to the time of Hippocrates and that medical tradition of healing, right? So this globalized medical culture isn't just white Western Judeo-Christian, right? It incorporates many different practitioners from many parts of the world, including many different religions and socio-economic groups. And we find it all over the world, right? That being said, within cultures, there are multiple medical viewpoints and traditions. So we can't really talk about an Indian medical system as if it's something homogenous, just like we can't talk about an American medical system as if it's something homogenous. I suspect just like even within this room, we have a much more diverse experience than we'd be willing to admit. Right? So probably all of us practice some sort of combination of this globalized medicine. You break an arm, you probably go to the emergency room and get it set. But your own family traditions, your own home traditions probably dictate how you treat other types of diseases as well. So it's a mixture. Just because you're in a certain place doesn't mean you share a medical tradition with everybody else in that place. These ideas of homeopathic, Western, holistic are all sort of inexact terms because probably we all use some mixture or combination of all of these types of medical traditions in everyday life. So when we study medical systems, we really need to study them as worldviews, not just as how we treat disease, but how people believe the world works, right? So people will have a certain logic and some sort of standardization that affords predictability to how people will treat a disease, right? So let me think of some examples. In some systems, healers are trained via an apprenticeship program, right? So you have to learn about a medical system by apprenticing under a shaman or some sort of other healer. In other traditions, like this globalized medical tradition, you go to med school, right? And you study for 5 years, you study real hard, and then you do a residency, and then you become a doctor that way. In other traditions, it's something that's hereditary, so you have to be born into a family that practices medicine, right? So all of these factors apply to how medicine is treated. The other thing is that typically the way that we work in our system is that we start off with a diagnosis, right? So you'll go and see a doctor or a healer of some sort. They'll look you over. They'll come up with a diagnosis. They'll say, okay, maybe they'll give you some tests and like, okay, well, this is what's wrong with you. You have this vitamin deficiency, this allergy, this abnormality in your heart. Knowing that we have this diagnosis, then we can go on to a treatment. And that treatment might involve some sort of therapy, some sort of medicine, some sort of change in lifestyle, right? But it doesn't always work like that. In other traditions, the diagnosis might come after the healing takes place, right? So in shamanic traditions that involve psychoactive plants, for example, where people will travel to a different realm, the process of diagnosis and treatment is simultaneous because that illness can be caused from some sort of external force. So it's only once that external force is rectified that the healing happens, but the diagnosis and treatment are simultaneous, right? Determining a successful treatment is something that's actually also cultural. So how do you know when a patient is healed? In our tradition, maybe that's sort of clear cut, maybe it's not clear cut. If you have chronic pain, maybe just getting that pain under control is enough. But maybe another person would say a successful outcome is cessation of all pain, right? So you don't have to keep on taking a drug. I have this story that my advisor told me about studying disease in Rotuma, which is an island in the Pacific where he studied traditional healing. And so he said he was training with this healer, and this baby started hiccuping, which babies will do. And so the healer came up with an herbal remedy and gave it to the child, administered it to the child as a drink. The child drank it and kept hiccuping. And so my advisor asked, well, what's going on? The child is still hiccuping. You're like, yeah, that's good. That's a good outcome, right? I said, well, why is that a good outcome? I said, well, what would be really scary is if you had a sudden change in state, right? So any sudden change from going from hiccuping uncontrollably to absolutely no hiccups would be very jarring to the body and could hurt the child. So the successful outcome is to maintain the hiccups so that they drop off gradually, right? So that's a totally different concept than we might think of as a successful outcome, right? So we can't even really take that for granted, what healing means or what getting better means. If we have an upset stomach in our culture meaning my culture, because you guys have different cultures probably. My culture, when I have an upset stomach, we tend to treat it in a way that would soothe that upset stomach, right? So if I travel somewhere in the third world, if I get an upset tummy, I always bring Pepto-Bismol with me. I take the Pepto-Bismol and it sort of soothes my stomach and makes me feel a little bit better. That's a successful outcome in my perspective. But in other cultures, that's not how it works. If you're feeling upset, what you want to do is you want to say something very harsh, maybe something bitter that will force you to vomit, right? The idea being that whatever is causing that uneasiness in your stomach needs to be purged. You need to get rid of it, right? So taking something very harsh and actually causing vomiting as opposed to soothing the stomach would be a successful outcome. So this all depends on our outlook, right? And body processes work like that too. So in China, where I worked for a long time, people eat very noisily and people belch, right? It's just it's a common thing. It's not rude. It's a normal, healthy body function. If we had we belched a lot and very loudly, we had that sort of gas, people would think something was wrong with us, right? So again, you can't put your own cultural lens on somebody else's system of healing, right? In general, where we go, anywhere, we can classify theories of illness as being due to one of two causes. So we can have a biological cause or a non-biological cause. Biological causes commonly are things like a bacterium that can cause a strep throat, for example, a fungus that can cause a skin rash, allergens, toxins, something like that causes this biological reaction that has a biological origin. But we also believe, as do many other cultures, in non-biological causes of disease as well. So we have an atmospheric component. When it starts blowing Kona, right, we get all that hydrosulfuric acid from the volcano on Big Island. You get fog, you can make your throat really itchy, it gives you tears. So that's a non-biological cause of disease. We also believe that there's seasonality, right, that you get a cold from being wet, right? If you're outside and it's cold outside and you get wet and you don't change your clothes, you'll catch a cold. Right? That's why your mom always put a scarf on you before you ran off into a Chicago winter, because that catching a cold, we have this perception has this environmental cause and not necessarily biological. And some of these we believe are quite real. You get altitude sickness if you go too high too quickly, things like that. So there are a number of theories about how these environments can affect your ease or dis-ease, right? And so other people believe in astrology. So at certain months or at a certain overlap of sun and moon or certain stars, your body is predisposed to sickness, right? So if your Mercury is in retrograde, you're likely to get sick, and that's something that you need to watch out for. Now, we have this concept that a lot of people study and take very seriously of a placebo effect, right? So the idea of a placebo is that a treatment can be effective if a patient believes that a treatment will be effective, regardless of what that treatment is. So whenever we do a clinical study of a new drug or a new plant, we want to test its efficiency, how well it works to treat a certain disease. We always test that against a control group that receives a placebo. And the reason is that almost always that group that receives a placebo will also have a positive response. So you have a group that gets medicine, you have a group that gets a placebo, and you have a group that receives nothing. That group that receives a placebo will often have a beneficial outcome compared to that group that gets nothing. So we control for that, and we understand that, and it's something that's actually measurable. So if you take a pill and you feed it to somebody and you tell them that it's a stimulant and that you're going to measure their heart rate, even if that pill is completely inert, you can typically measure an increase in the heart rate of that patient just because they believe that pill will have that type of efficacy. So, so that in and of itself suggests that there is a cultural component to healing, and that going to a doctor and being in that setting and seeing somebody with a white lab coat and a stethoscope and getting your heart rate monitored and your height and weight, that very ritual is somehow healing in and of itself. And that's part of the reason why we participate in that ritual every time we get sick. And people have studied this like a lot. So it turns out that certain pills have certain colors because of this placebo effect. So hot colored pills, so pills that are like orange or yellow or red, tend to be much more effective as stimulants than do cold colored pills. So if you think to yourself, if you've ever taken a stimulant, it's probably been red, orange, or yellow, or some other sort of hot pill. Capsules, in general, tend to have a higher efficacy than pills, right? So if you have one of those gel caps that's filled with some sort of powder, people tend to perceive those as being healthier than pills, and patients will have a stronger impact by taking capsules as opposed to pills. Injections are like the bee's knees, and so injections, people, if you get an injection, people are willing to believe that they will be healed. That seems something that's very, very serious, and that elicits a very marked placebo effect in our culture. So there's also interactions with culture and placebo. So studies have shown that placebo effect for, say, ulcer is much more pronounced in Brazil than it is in Germany. So something about the cultural context and the belief system of Brazilians versus Germans leads to a higher placebo rate for ulcer treatments than for Germans, suggesting that there's also other types of placebo effects that are more effective in certain cultures than in others. So the placebo effect is something that we take seriously, and that's an important part of our healing rituals and our healing traditions. There's also the opposite of a placebo effect, which is the nocebo effect. And this we talk about much less because it's sort of harder to intellectualize, but the nocebo effect is when you believe something bad will happen to you, or the very process of believing that you are sick actually makes you sick, actually gives you symptoms of disease, right? So we'll start off big picture, and then we'll go more specific. So superstition, I think, is a great example of nocebo in our globalized culture. So this idea that if you break a mirror, you'll have 7 years of bad luck. Actually breaking a mirror might really put you on edge and might actually create this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy where you have a bad day because you believe you're going to have a bad day, right? People that are diagnosed with some horrible disease, even if they don't actually have that biological disease, might begin to manifest those symptoms. And that can lead to depression, and that can lead to this feedback loop where believing you're unwell can actually lead to your being unwell. So it's much less studied and much less talked about, but the nocebo effect is equally as important in healing as the placebo effect. And finally, we have this idea of spirit activities, right? That health and disease is actually extrinsic to our own body and to biological processes, but is being inflicted on us by external forces that are surrounding us. So spirits or demons or devils that are inflicting certain symptoms on us. We see in places like Southeast Asia, if you go to Thailand, people have these spirit houses outside of their own homes. And most people have these. It's not just for the wealthy or for the show-offs. And so people will build outside of their own home like a little mailbox-sized house to house the spirits. And the idea is that by giving these spirits a place to live outside of the house, they won't haunt people living inside the main house and won't cause disease. And it's pretty cool because people will take this seriously enough that if you build an addition onto your house, people will go out and build a little addition onto the spirit house so that they have a place to grow along with your family. Do you have a question?
Is that the same kind of thing that was like in Mulan?
I didn't see Mulan.
No.
Maybe. I don't know. Did anybody see Mulan? I don't know. I'll watch it and get back to you about that. But yeah, so the idea is that by placating these spirits, it's sort of preventative maintenance. So maybe you do yoga, or maybe you take statins, or maybe you take vitamins to make yourself feel better and prevent disease from coming. In Thailand, they build these spirit houses to keep the spirits away from them and causing disease. In Tibet, there's a similar type of tradition maybe where people will recite mantras, right? So Om Mani Padme Hum is this mantra that means behold the jewel in the heart of the lotus. The sounds of those chants are meaningful in Tibetan tradition, and they accrue good merit and sort of counteract the negative impacts of karma, of bad juju that's accumulated over your past lives. People will recite these mantras and then walk around and spin these prayer wheels, and these prayer wheels contain parchment in which Om Mani Padme Hum is written over and over and over again. And so in spinning these wheels, you're essentially reciting that mantra over and over and over again. It's activating that mantra and preventative maintenance from accruing karma and from getting sick. In Catholic churches, we light candles, right? Same sort of idea. It's to sort of as an offering or an appeasement to set our minds straight and to cleanse ourselves when we're mourning for somebody. So why don't I pause here for a second and talk about our plant of the day. Anybody recognize this? Yeah, so this is sugarcane. This is one of about 100 varieties that was cultivated here in Hawaii. The Hawaiian uses of it were many. So in Hawaii, they would either chew on it or they'd extract the juice. And it was often used in conjunction with medicine. So if you were taking medicinal plants, you'd add sugarcane as an additive to those medical concoctions. And it probably made them taste a little bit better. They also would use sugarcane. Good thing you're wearing glasses so you don't poke out an eye. They'd also use it as to interplant in sweet potato cultivation, right? So we talked a little bit about that before. As moist winds would blow across sweet potato fields, moisture would collect on the leaves and would drip down and irrigate sweet potatoes. So it was used to interplant into gather moisture in other habitats. And of course, sugarcane became the major export, an agricultural export of Hawaii during the time of the sugar barons. Played a really large role in the formation of modern Hawaii and the overthrow of the monarchy. These sugar barons that were participating in a land grab, wanted more land to grow sugar. But it grows all over the place. It's a beautiful plant. Some are ornamental, some have more sugar content than others. Incidentally, we don't actually get most of our table sugar from sugarcane anymore. Instead, most of our commercial sugar is produced using beets. People grow sugar beets, and you can produce more sugar per hectare with beets than you can with sugarcane. It's a lot less labor intensive. So sugarcane production on Maui, at least large commercial sugarcane production on Maui, has ceased. So you no longer fly over Maui and see the big fields of sugarcane. It's unclear what's going to take over those fields. But I don't think you guys got to see that in any of the other labs, so I wanted to make sure that I brought in some example of sugarcane. Okay, so resolving illness then, this is one of the things that we talk about later, again, depends on understanding the cause of that illness, right? So in the pharmacological system, if you find out what's making you sick, you can take something to make yourself feel better, right? So if you have a bacterial infection, you can take an antibiotic, and that'll make you feel better. If the cause of your disease, though, is environmental, you have different choices. You can find out what it is that's making you sick. If it's fog from the volcano, you can move, so you can go somewhere else. You can try to shut down the volcano, and good luck with that. Or maybe you can install like some sort of HEPA filter in your house or some other thing to filter out the gas. I don't think a filter would work personally, but I don't know. Maybe there's some other thing that you could do to make yourself feel better, right? But you wouldn't treat fog with taking some sort of pharmacological medicine, I don't think. if your disease is cultural, you can try and remedy it in some other way, right? So if your cosmology is bad, your astrology is bad, maybe there's some way that you can counteract the effects of a retrograde Mercury. You know, if there's spirits that are making you sick, maybe there's some offering that you can offer up to the spirits, or maybe you can distract them in some way, or capture them, or call it Ghostbusters. I mean, whatever. There's some other way that you can treat it other than pharmacological, right? So understanding the cultural context for illness is really essential for understanding the healing process as well. The other thing that I want to talk about when we talk about disease is this idea of normality, right? So understanding what's normal and what's non-normal. And so some cultures might consider something a disease, whereas other cultures might consider that a part of the human experience, right? So we have a lot of variation across cultures about what we considered normal personality, right? So in our culture, maybe we value people that are very outgoing and aggressive and talk fast and talk a lot, and those people make great used car salesmen, for example, right? But in other cultures, that type of aggression or extrovertedness might be seen as something that's a bit off, and something that we need to watch out for. In our culture, we see autism, or people that are on the autism spectrum, as something that is often treated as a disease, or something that we can use therapy to improve that condition and make people on that spectrum more like other people that aren't on that spectrum. Other cultures really value that insight and those alternative skills that people on the autism spectrum bring to tasks like spiritual practitioners and insight into other types of problems that people on the spectrum can deal with in better ways than people that are on the spectrum, right? So that perspective on what's normal and what's abnormal is also an important component of what we consider dis-ease versus health. Sexuality, again, is something that we don't agree on across cultures. So we have a very binary view of sexuality. You're male or you're female, although that's starting to change now, especially over the past decade or so. But in other cultures, gender is something that's much more fluid. Sexuality is something that's much more fluid as well. So it's not something that would require like reassignment therapy if you don't identify with your with the gender that other people would perceive you to be, right? That last one, and sanity as well. People that are considered bipolar in the United States, in other cultures, could be revered especially for their shamanic propensities, right? So people that are bipolar are sometimes considered to have their feet in two worlds, right? So their feet in this world in which we exist, but also hear voices or hallucinate or are perceiving things that are considered from a different, often spiritual realm. And that power can be harnessed for healing in cultures that believe very heavily in spiritual intervention and health of humans, right? So a lot of this idea of normalcy becomes real important in shamanic traditions, right? So these shamans are practitioners who mediate between the human and the spiritual worlds, typically in an altered state of consciousness. So these people that our culture views as abnormal, because they either occupy these liminal stages between two sexes, or between the spiritual and the human realm, or some other sort of abnormality we would perceive, could actually be really revered for being able to navigate between a spiritual and a mundane realm in a healing tradition that uses shamanism. In fact, there was in Native American culture, especially in the Navajo tradition, the shamans were typically what we would consider transgender people. So they're called Berdashis, and they were typically identified with an alternative gender, and so that duality made them really valuable as shamans. right? And this whole ability to communicate with the spiritual world. We learned a little bit about this duality also using psychoactive plants with Dr. Merlin in his discussion of psychoactive plants in shamanic traditions. One of the coolest examples that I think of, although there's lots of plants that are used to achieve these altered states, is this plant Salvia divinorum. And this comes from the Mazatec culture in Oaxaca, the same region where psilocybe mushrooms are from. And the reason that I like this plant in particular is because this is an example of a plant that's not found in the wild at all. So it's only found in cultivation in gardens of shamans who use this plant to achieve an altered state in order to communicate with the spiritual realm to diagnose and treat diseases. And in the Mazatec culture, which is this mixture of Catholicism and animistic religion, Salvia divinorum is considered to be an embodiment of the Virgin Mary, whereas the psilocybe mushrooms are considered to be an embodiment of Jesus Christ. So it's just an interesting twist on things and how people are able to commune with the spirit world and how that relates to disease. So we covered a lot of ground, and hopefully this will set the framework now for when we start talking about plants, that we can't just say, this plant is used to treat this, or this plant works against this, because there's a whole cultural layer that you have to consider before you can make those types of statements. So I will leave you with some key concepts, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you guys may have. Or not. Okay, well, have a great time in lab. You guys are doing a couple of meetings, and we'll see you on Monday. Hey.
I have a little bit of trouble, like.
Are you serious?
Yeah, I never started
What questions do you want to ask?
Well, no, because I looked in the back. There was no payment at second, like,
Oh, okay. Well, so what's your hypothesis? How do you think it's changed over time? Do you think it's a generational thing, or you think it's more in your parents' lifetimes?
Yeah.
oh, yeah. How would she?
Okay. And this is which generation? Your parents' generation. Okay. What's their ethnicity? Chinese. Okay. And were they born here or were they born abroad? Okay. So if you think their times has changed, you could ask, how long ago did they come here? Okay. Well, if you could ask them, how they, is it your mom that does the cooking, or is it your dad that does the cooking, or both of them?
Mom.
Your mom does the cooking. So, does she cook out of cookbooks? That's one thing to say is, like, does she have any of her old cookbooks? And then, how many of these ingredients can you still find? Or, like, how many of these ingredients have you substituted? Why did you substitute those ingredients? Or if she doesn't have the old cookbook, you could just ask her, like, What are some ingredients that you can find